What if I told you there was a year when the sun literally disappeared, plunging the entire world into darkness and cold that killed millions? In 536 AD, something catastrophic happened that modern science has only recently understood. Crops failed globally, empires collapsed, and entire civilizations vanished overnight. From Ireland to China, survivors recorded the same terrifying phenomenon. A sun that gave light but no warmth, skies that turned bronze, and temperatures that brought killing frost in summer. This wasn't mythology or exaggeration. This was the year that nearly ended human civilization forever. In the 54th year of his life and the 9th year of his reign, Emperor Justinian had trained himself to greet each dawn as a gift from God and an opportunity for glory. But the dawn of this particular day, in the year 536, greeted him with the face of catastrophe. The sun rose, certainly, as celestial mechanics demanded it must. Yet the light that spilled across the new Rome belonged to no morning he had ever witnessed, no natural law he had ever studied, no prophecy he had ever been warned to expect. Standing on the ramparts of his great palace, Justinian possessed the pale, sharp-featured intensity of one who had never quite shed the provincial anxieties of his Illyrian childhood. Despite ruling an empire that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the Euphrates. This morning, however, even imperial confidence could not explain what his eyes reported. The sun hung in the sky, like a bronze coin dropped into dark water, visible, certainly, but drained of its essential nature. Where celestial fire should have blazed with the authority that banished night and awakened the world to another day of commerce, conquest, and prayer, there remained only a pale disk that seemed to apologize for its own existence. The light it cast held no warmth, carried no promise, offered no benediction to the city that called itself the New Rome. Around the emperor, courtiers gathered in the peculiar silence that settles over those who witness the impossible. Chamberlains, who had perfected the art of reading imperial moods, found themselves speechless before a phenomenon that transcended political calculation. Palace guards, men selected for their ability to remain unmoved by earthly threats, shifted nervously as they stared at a sky that had forgotten how to be sky. Below them, Constantinople stirred to reluctant wakefulness. 500,000 souls inhabiting the greatest city on earth began their daily routines under illumination that belonged neither to day nor night, but to some third category of existence for which human language possessed no adequate term. Merchants opening their shops held oil lamps to parchment contracts, squinting at documents that should have been perfectly legible in what passed for morning light. Bakers kneading dough for the day's bread found themselves working by lamplight, as if dawn had failed to arrive, though their sundials insisted that Helios had indeed begun his appointed journey across the heavens. In the great markets where the wealth of 2 continents converged, Syrian traders who had traveled every route between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean gathered around their goods with the bewildered expressions of men whose expertise had suddenly become worthless. These were people who could read weather patterns in cloud formations, who could predict storms by the color of sunset, who could navigate by stars invisible to less experienced eyes. Yet this morning, their accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent interpreting celestial signs proved as useless as a map of a country that had ceased to exist. The strangeness was not confined to the capital. Across the empire's vast territories, from Britain's fog-wrapped coastlines to Egypt's sun-baked monuments, identical bewilderment gripped populations who had awakened to find their world transformed overnight. Gothic warriors in Italy, men whose ancestors had followed Alaric across the Alps and who feared nothing that walked on 2 legs or 4, stood in their camps pointing at a sun that gave light without heat, radiance without comfort. In the workshops of Alexandria, where the greatest minds of the age bent their intellects to questions of theology, astronomy, and natural philosophy, scholars who had spent decades calculating the precise movements of celestial bodies found their theories inadequate to explain the phenomenon that confronted them. The astrolabe readings were correct. The sun occupied exactly the position it should at this hour of this day of this year. Yet the reality before their eyes bore no resemblance to the mathematical predictions that had never failed them before. Far to the east, Chinese astronomers in the courts of the Northern Wei dynasty took careful measurements with bronze instruments of exquisite precision. Their records would later show that the sun's apparent strength had diminished to precisely 1/3 of its normal power, though they possessed no theoretical framework to explain such a catastrophic reduction. The Middle Kingdom's bureaucrats, trained to document everything with meticulous accuracy, began composing the reports that would preserve for posterity the exact moment when heaven withdrew its mandate in the most literal way imaginable. In the fire temples of Persia, where sacred flames had burned continuously since the time of Cyrus, priests tending the eternal blazes noticed something that sent cold fear through their ritual-trained hearts. The flames that symbolized Ahura Mazda's triumph over the forces of darkness flickered and dimmed without cause, as if some cosmic wind had begun to blow out the lights that had illuminated the world since creation itself. These priests, men whose lives were dedicated to maintaining the cosmic balance between light and darkness, found themselves confronting evidence that the fundamental order of existence had somehow shifted. Across the regions that would become Gaul, farmers of the Franks saw their new crops dusted with frost, ice spreading through ground that ought to have been turning warm for planting. These were people whose ancestors had worked the same soil for generations beyond counting, who could feel the seasons changing in their bones, who knew the rhythms of growth and harvest as intimately as they knew their own heartbeats. Yet this morning brought killing cold in what their accumulated wisdom insisted should be mild weather. The catastrophe had a source, though the civilizations struggling to comprehend its effects possessed neither the scientific knowledge nor the global communications necessary to identify the cause. Somewhere on Earth, perhaps at Ilopango in distant Central America, perhaps at Krakatoa in the Java Sea, perhaps at some other volcanic peak whose name history would not preserve, a mountain had spoken with a voice that changed the world. Before the strange sunrise, an eruption had thrown 40 cubic kilometers of ash and stone into the skies, spreading a veil of volcanic dust that girdled the earth. Sulfur dioxide transformed into billions of microscopic droplets of sulfuric acid, forming a barrier between Earth and Sun that would persist for 18 months. The blast that created this atmospheric catastrophe released energy equivalent to thousands of hydrogen bombs, though the civilizations experiencing its effects could only describe it in terms of divine wrath or cosmic disaster. Birds fell from skies they could no longer navigate, their internal compasses confused by illumination that provided insufficient contrast to distinguish Earth from heaven. Migratory species that had followed the same routes for millions of years found themselves lost in a landscape where familiar landmarks disappeared in the strange half-light that was neither day nor night, but some unprecedented hybrid of both. From his vantage point on the palace walls, Justinian could not have known that he was witnessing the end of the world he had spent his reign attempting to restore. The dream of reuniting the Roman Empire, of healing the schisms that had divided East from West, of rebuilding the glory that had been Rome. All these ambitions would prove as fragile as morning mist before the catastrophe that had begun with this failed sunrise. The confident civilization that built the Hagia Sophia, that codified law for the ages, that believed human achievement could rival divine creation itself, had awakened to discover that nature possessed weapons against which imperial power provided no protection whatsoever. Classical antiquity, which had seemed as eternal as the monuments it raised to its own glory, was beginning its final chapter. No one realized the day before had brought the final ordinary sunrise, slipping by without ritual or remark. Now, as Justinian stood watching a sun that could not warm the stones beneath his feet, 18 months of twilight stretched ahead, like a sentence passed by judges whose authority exceeded any earthly court. In this strange light that belonged neither to day nor night, the ancient world began its slow surrender to forces that human ambition had never learned to master, and would never have the chance to. Just months before that terrible dawn, the world had never seemed more magnificent, more capable, more perfectly balanced on the edge of golden ages that stretched toward horizons bright with promise. In Constantinople, where the strange light would soon confound an emperor, victory parades had filled the streets with such splendor that even the city's jaded population stopped their daily commerce to marvel. Belisarius, the general whose tactical genius had restored Roman Africa to imperial control after a century of Vandal rule, rode through cheering crowds while wagons groaned under the weight of treasure that proved reconquest could still pay dividends. Gold that had adorned Vandal kings now filled Byzantine coffers. Silver that had decorated barbarian palaces would soon fund the most ambitious architectural project the world had ever conceived. The Hagia Sophia rose from Constantinople's heart, like a prayer made manifest in stone and mortar, its impossible dome defying not merely engineering logic, but the very laws that governed what mortal hands could achieve. Architects who had spent lifetimes mastering the principles of load and stress found themselves pushing beyond theoretical limits, guided by imperial vision that refused to acknowledge the boundary between possible and miraculous. Each day brought new solutions to problems that had never been solved, new techniques that would influence cathedral builders for the next 1,000 years. Workers ascending scaffolding that reached toward heaven itself could look down on a city that commanded the narrow waters where Europe met Asia, where the wealth of 2 continents converged in markets that never slept. Merchants from Britain brought tin and amber. Traders from Ethiopia carried ivory and spices. Chinese silk arrived via caravan routes that had operated with clockwork precision for centuries. The new Rome had become what the old Rome had always aspired to be, the center of a world that acknowledged no serious competitors. For all its brilliance, Constantinople was but one jewel set in the diadem of civilizations that had risen to unparalleled strength and complexity. Far to the east, the Sassanid Empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Arabian Peninsula, its borders encompassing lands that had known Persian rule since Cyrus first proclaimed himself King of Kings. Khosrau I, whom his subjects called Anushirvan, the immortal soul, had transformed administrative efficiency into an art form that would be studied and envied for centuries. From his palace at Ctesiphon, whose ivory-columned halls rivaled anything in Constantinople for sheer opulent magnificence, Khosrau commanded an empire that had achieved the delicate balance between centralized authority and provincial autonomy. His tax reforms ensured steady revenues without crushing the agricultural communities that formed the empire's economic foundation, while his legal codes provided justice that earned respect even from foreign observers who otherwise dismissed Persian customs as barbarous excess. Persian engineers had completed irrigation projects that transformed desert wasteland into gardens that seemed to mock natural limitations. The Qanat system, tunneling underground channels across hundreds of miles, brought mountain snowmelt to regions where rain was a seasonal rumor rather than a reliable expectation. Cities flourished in landscapes that geography suggested should remain empty, their prosperity a testament to human ingenuity applied with imperial resources and generational patience. In India, the Gupta Empire maintained its grip on territories that encompassed the subcontinent's most fertile regions and profitable trade routes. Though the dynasty had passed its absolute peak, the court at Pataliputra still commanded respect from rulers as distant as the Roman emperors and Chinese kings who sought Indian mathematicians, physicians, and philosophers. The decimal system that would eventually revolutionize global commerce had been perfected in Gupta universities, while Sanskrit literature achieved artistic heights that would influence poetry in languages not yet invented. Indian merchants who had established trading posts from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea sailed in ships whose navigational instruments represented centuries of accumulated maritime knowledge. Their monsoon-timed voyages carried not merely goods, but ideas, religious concepts, and artistic techniques that enriched every civilization they touched. The prosperity that flowed back to Indian ports funded temple construction on a scale that suggested divine favor for human enterprise. China, meanwhile, remained divided among competing kingdoms whose mutual antagonism had not prevented remarkable cultural and technological achievements. The Northern Wei, Eastern Wei, and Western Wei dynasties, despite their political fragmentation, maintained the Silk Road's easternmost terminus with bureaucratic efficiency that impressed even their enemies. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea commanded premium prices in markets from Antioch to Alexandria, while Chinese philosophical and scientific texts were copied in libraries throughout Central Asia. The imperial workshops that produced these export goods represented industrial organization that would not be matched anywhere else for another 1,000 years. Specialization had reached levels where individual craftsmen spent entire lifetimes perfecting single techniques, their expertise contributing to collective achievements that no individual genius could have accomplished alone. Poetry, painting, and scholarship flourished in courts that competed as fiercely in cultural achievement as they did on battlefields. Across the Pacific, in a hemisphere whose existence remained unknown to old-world civilizations, Teotihuacan housed perhaps 200,000 inhabitants in an urban environment that rivaled Rome itself for sophistication and grandeur. The Pyramid of the Sun dominated a cityscape laid out according to astronomical principles that demonstrated mathematical knowledge equal to anything achieved in Alexandria or Athens. Markets along the Avenue of the Dead offered goods from regions as distant as Guatemala and Arizona, carried by trade networks that connected cultures across thousands of miles. Maya cities in the tropical forests had achieved architectural and artistic heights that would astonish European explorers a millennium later. Their astronomical observations surpassed contemporary achievements in accuracy and sophistication, while their mathematical systems included concepts like zero that Mediterranean scholars would not discover for centuries. Stone temples rose from jungle canopies, like monuments to the human capacity for transforming natural environments according to cultural vision. From Britain's Saxon kingdoms to Ethiopia's highland empire of Aksum, similar patterns of achievement and confidence marked the year 536 as a pinnacle of human accomplishment. Trade networks spanned continents, architectural projects challenged natural law, military campaigns extended civilized control over ever greater territories. Scholarship flourished in monasteries and academies. Artists created works that seemed destined for immortal appreciation. Rulers planned dynasties that would endure for generations, yet unborn. To all who lived then, catastrophe seemed impossible. Weather patterns had remained stable for centuries. Agricultural techniques had proven reliable across seasons of plenty and scarcity alike. Political systems had evolved to handle the stresses that had destroyed earlier empires. The accumulated wisdom of ages suggested that human ingenuity, properly applied, could solve any problem that nature or circumstance might present. While the dome of Hagia Sophia was still being calculated into balance, while Persian planners traced the lines of irrigation, while Chinese copyists filled shelves of seemingly eternal libraries, while Maya watchers marked the heavens for eclipses not yet seen, volcanic fire was already rising under nameless peaks, preparing to break the confidence of every civilization it would strike. The world had never been more ready for 1,000 years of progress, more confident in its trajectory toward ever greater achievements, more certain that human wisdom had finally learned to master the forces that had limited earlier ages. In that confidence, in that very certainty of continued ascent, lay the seeds of a vulnerability that nature was about to exploit with devastating thoroughness. The eruption column that birthed this global catastrophe rose 45 kilometers into the sky, punching through the troposphere with the violence of a spear thrust through silk, piercing the stratosphere where no earthly weather had ever dared to venture. At this impossible height, where the air grew thin as a dying breath and temperatures plummeted to depths that could freeze mercury solid, the volcanic payload met the jet streams that circled the planet like invisible rivers flowing through heaven itself. What had begun as a localized explosion in some remote corner of the world, whether the volcanic peaks of Central America or the island chains of distant Java, transformed into a planetary catastrophe as atmospheric currents seized the mountain's offerings and began their patient work of distribution. Sulfur dioxide, expelled from the Earth's molten heart in quantities beyond human comprehension, underwent a chemical metamorphosis in the stratosphere's alien environment. Molecule by molecule, the gas transformed into billions upon billions of microscopic droplets of sulfuric acid, each one smaller than a grain of pollen, each one capable of reflecting sunlight back into the cosmic void before it could warm the world below. Together, they formed a veil that wrapped around the Earth like a funeral shroud, woven from atomized poison. Within weeks of the initial eruption, this aerial ocean of destruction had begun its circumnavigation of the globe. Chinese chroniclers in the Northern Wei capital, men whose families had recorded celestial phenomena for centuries, found themselves reaching for new vocabulary to describe what fell from their skies. Yellow dust descended like snow in the third month of summer, settling on rooftops and pavements with the gentle persistence of a seasonal blessing perverted into curse. But this was no ordinary dust. It carried the metallic tang of sulfur, the bitter taste of death itself, and when mixed with rainwater, it burned the skin like diluted acid. Those who studied the strange vapors by tasting them, an act born of natural philosophy, wrote that its flavor was unknown to all the pharmacological traditions they had read. It was the taste of deep earth, of furnace heat, of distances so vast that the mind could not encompass them. In their careful brushstrokes, preserved on bamboo strips that survived the chaos to follow, they documented the exact day when the sky began to rain the entrails of a mountain they would never see. In monasteries scattered across Ireland's green hills, monks who had dedicated their lives to the mysteries of bread and prayer discovered that their most fundamental assumptions about creation had suddenly become void. The loaves that should have risen with the reliability of sunrise remained flat as stones. The yeast that had served their communities since St. Patrick's time, now as lifeless as the flour that contained it. Brother Coleman of Clonmacnoise, whose gentle hands had coaxed countless loaves from recalcitrant dough, knelt in his monastery's kitchen and wept tears that spoke of more than culinary failure. The temperature had dropped below the threshold where yeast could survive, though the monks possessed no scientific framework to understand why their sacred craft had abandoned them. They knew only that bread, the the staff of life and the body of Christ in their daily communion, had become impossible to create. In their illuminated manuscripts, marginalia recorded in trembling script, they described how the very air seemed to have forgotten the recipes that sustained human life. Constantinople's greatest historian, Procopius, trained his scholarly eye on the phenomenon that had transformed his emperor's mourning, and found his prose adequate to capture what previous generations would have dismissed as impossible fantasy. The sun, he wrote, with the precision of a man who understood that his words would be scrutinized by posterity, gave forth its light without radiance, and seemed exceedingly like the moon during this whole year. His ink, mixed with lamp-black and gum arabic according to formulas perfected over centuries, recorded the moment when natural law revealed its contingent nature. A cooling, later measured at just 3 degrees Celsius, was enough to break apart the farming systems that had fed millions across continents. In regions where snow had never fallen within living memory, farmers awakened to discover white crystals covering grain that had been green the evening before. August in Mesopotamia brought frost to date palms that had weathered the desert's extremes for centuries, their fronds blackening overnight as if touched by some cosmic blight. The Mediterranean, that middle sea around which civilization had organized itself since the time of the Phoenicians, began its own slow surrender to the changed climate. Water temperatures that had remained stable for millennia dropped with the remorseless logic of physical law, disrupting the evaporation patterns that brought rain to Africa's northern coast, to Syria's fertile valleys, to the Italian peninsula, where Rome's heirs still believed they commanded the world's destiny. Fishermen who had learned their craft from fathers and grandfathers, stretching back to Homer's age, found their nets coming up empty from waters that had never failed to provide. The sea itself seemed diseased, its familiar rhythms broken by forces that operated beyond the reach of maritime wisdom accumulated over millennia. The sky assumed a color for which no existing language possessed adequate description. This was not the honest blue of normal weather, nor the gray of approaching storms, nor even the black of absolute night. Instead, sunlight filtered through the volcanic veil created a perpetual bronze twilight that turned familiar landscapes into scenes from fever dreams. The red sky that poets had used as metaphor for divine anger became literal truth as particles of pulverized rock scattered celestial light into wavelengths that spoke of cosmic catastrophe. Darkness at noon ceased to be an expression of impossible contradiction and became the daily reality confronting populations from Britain to Bengal. Stars became visible during daylight hours, their familiar patterns appearing in skies that should have been too bright for stellar observation. Astronomers who had spent lifetimes mapping celestial movements found themselves able to conduct observations at hours when such work should have been impossible. Birds, whose internal navigation systems had evolved to read subtle variations in light and magnetic fields, fell from skies they could no longer interpret. Geese that should have been migrating south for winter remained confused in northern marshes, while swallows that had followed the same routes for countless generations crashed into obstacles they could not distinguish in the alien illumination. The natural order that had governed terrestrial existence since life first stirred in primordial seas had not merely been disrupted, it had been fundamentally rewritten by forces that acknowledged no precedent, no tradition, no accumulated wisdom about how the world was supposed to function. In the 18 months that this great veil would persist, blocking approximately 30% of normal sunlight from reaching Earth's surface, every assumption about seasonal patterns, agricultural timing, and climatic reliability would prove as fragile as ice in summer sun. Even as the veil thickened and stretched around the planet with flawless precision, the civilizations beneath it lacked both the science to name its source and the means to join their voices in a common response. Each faced the disaster alone, reading the signs through faith and philosophy, unprepared for such vast and lingering upheaval. The veil had begun its long labor, settling over humanity like a predator that savors the slow kill. The grain died first, turning black in fields that had fed empires for 1,000 years. Its death so sudden and complete that farmers who had inherited agricultural wisdom from countless generations found themselves staring at crops that had forgotten how to live. In Ireland, where monastic scribes maintained the most meticulous records in northern Europe, the annals of Ulster would later preserve the catastrophe in words as spare and final as a gravestone inscription. A failure of bread from the year 536 AD to 539 AD. 3 words, failure of bread, encompassing a disaster that would hollow out the island's population and transform survivors into shadows of their former selves. Brother Finian of Clonard, whose monastery had weathered Viking raids and Saxon incursions with the resilience that comes from divine protection and careful husbandry, stood in fields where barley stalks had withered overnight like flowers touched by winter's first hard frost. The grain that should have been swelling toward harvest hung limp from stems that had lost their structural integrity. The kernels inside shriveled to husks that crumbled at the touch of desperate fingers. He had seen crop failures before. All Irish farmers knew the capricious nature of weather that could turn abundance to scarcity in a single season. But this destruction transcended normal patterns of drought or flood, disease or pest. The plants had simply stopped growing, as if some essential connection between earth and heaven had been severed by invisible hands. Across the narrow sea that separated Ireland from Britain, Anglo-Saxon farmers who had carved kingdoms from post-Roman chaos discovered that their hard-won prosperity could vanish as quickly as morning mist. In Wessex, where King Cerdic had established Saxon dominance through careful cultivation of both military prowess and agricultural abundance, entire villages gathered around fields that had become monuments to futility. The wheat that had promised to feed communities through another winter lay twisted and black, its familiar golden color replaced by the charcoal hue of vegetation that had frozen while still alive. Children who had never known true hunger learned the meaning of empty bellies, while their parents faced calculations no human should have to make. Which mouths to feed when there was not enough food to sustain them all? In the olive groves of Italy, where ancient trees had weathered the rise and fall of empires, something impossible happened overnight. Olivia Maxima, whose family had tended the same grove outside Ravenna since the time of Augustus, awakened to discover that trees which had survived barbarian invasions and imperial civil wars had surrendered to a single night of unprecedented cold. The sound that greeted the dawn was one she had never heard before, the sharp crack of wood splitting under stresses that wood was never meant to endure. Olive trees that had been saplings when Christ walked the earth now stood like broken monuments, their trunks split vertically by ice that had formed inside their living tissue. Sap that should have been flowing with spring's renewal had frozen solid, expanding with enough force to shatter bark that had weathered a millennium of Mediterranean seasons. Her grandfather's careful grafting, techniques passed down through generations of patient cultivation, had been obliterated in a single night. The trees that had been expected to feed her children's children lay dying, their ancient root systems pumping nutrients to branches that would never again produce the oil that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries. Far to the east, in the rice paddies that fed China's vast population, farmers whose ancestors had perfected irrigation techniques during the Han Dynasty discovered that their sophisticated agricultural systems had become elaborate monuments to futility. In the Yangtze River Valley, where terraced fields climbed hillsides like green staircases leading toward heaven. The rice that formed the foundation of Chinese civilization had begun its own surrender to forces beyond human control. Master Zhou, whose family had managed the same irrigation channels for 8 generations, watched helplessly as rice shoots that should have been approaching harvest maturity turned brown in water that had become too cold to sustain plant life. The complex network of dikes and channels that regulated water flow with hydraulic precision had become useless when the fundamental problem was not water distribution but water temperature. His workers, men whose entire lives had been devoted to the precise timing that rice cultivation required, stood knee-deep in paddies that had become graves for crops they had nurtured since spring planting. The elaborate seasonal calendar that governed Chinese agriculture, knowledge accumulated over centuries of careful observation, had become irrelevant overnight. The failure was universal in its scope and devastating in its completeness. No latitude provided refuge, no elevation offered sanctuary. No irrigation system could compensate for the sun's failure to provide adequate warmth. In Scandinavia, where farming had always been a marginal proposition, requiring perfect timing and considerable luck, farmers who had planned to harvest barley in the brief northern summer found themselves facing winter before summer had properly begun. Olaf the Stout, whose farmstead in the fjords had sustained his extended family through winters that tested human endurance, made a decision that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Rather than watch his cattle starve slowly as pastures turned brown and died, he ordered the slaughter of animals his family had planned to keep for breeding stock. Better to preserve the meat through smoking and salting than to lose everything to a starvation that seemed to have no natural end. The sound of lowing cattle meeting their deaths echoed across valleys where such sounds had never been heard in summer months. Blood that should have been cycling through veins until natural old age or winter slaughter, now soaked into earth that had forgotten how to nurture grass. The careful husbandry that had adapted northern agriculture to harsh conditions proved inadequate when the conditions exceeded all previous definitions of harsh. Even Egypt, that gift of the Nile, whose agricultural abundance had sustained empires since pharaonic times, found its ancient rhythms disrupted by forces that operated beyond the river's traditional patterns. The great flood that should have deposited fertile silt across the delta arrived weak and muddy, lacking the volume and timing that had made Egyptian agriculture the wonder of the ancient world. Khenti, whose family had served as flood predictors for the Temple of Ptah since Ptolemaic times, stood on riverbanks where the annual inundation had failed to reach levels that had been reliable for centuries. The Nilometer that measured flood heights with mathematical precision registered numbers that made no sense according to accumulated wisdom about the river's behavior. Without the flood's fertilizing deposits, fields that had produced surplus grain for export to Constantinople and Rome lay cracked and barren. The granaries that had made Egypt the breadbasket of the Mediterranean began to empty for the first time since living memory began. Administrative papyri recorded the unprecedented. Egypt itself would need to import grain, if any could be found in a world where every agricultural region faced identical catastrophe. In the wine cellars of Gaul, where vintners had perfected techniques for preserving the grape's essence through seasons of plenty and scarcity, amphora after amphora cracked as their contents froze solid. Wine that had been expected to age for decades, developing the complex flavors that made Gallic vintages prized from Britain to Byzantium, became worthless as frozen liquid expanded beyond the capacity of pottery to contain it. Perhaps most tragically of all, seed grain that had been carefully preserved for the following year's planting, the genetic inheritance of agricultural communities stretching back to the Neolithic Revolution, began disappearing into the mouths of people who faced immediate starvation. Farmers who understood that consuming seed grain meant condemning future generations to famine found themselves choosing between certain death in the present and probable death in years to come. 3 consecutive years of harvest failure stretched ahead like a sentence of death, passed by judges who acknowledged no appeal. Agricultural knowledge that had sustained human civilization since the first wild grasses were domesticated became as useless as maps of countries that had never existed. In this new world, where summer brought frost and growing seasons ended before they began, humanity faced the prospect of starvation on a scale that had no precedent in recorded history. Constantinople had withstood sieges before. Gothic armies had crashed against its walls like waves against stone. Persian forces had exhausted themselves in futile assaults. Barbarian hordes had learned that the new Rome's defenses exceeded their capacity for sustained warfare. But the siege that began in 536 came from the sky itself, and against this enemy, no wall could provide protection. Justinian stood in the same palace halls where he had once received tribute from conquered kingdoms, watching his capital transform itself from the jewel of civilization into something that resembled the apocalyptic visions that hermit monks painted on monastery walls. 500,000 inhabitants, more souls than any other city on earth contained, required 800 tons of grain daily to sustain their magnificent existence. That number, once a testament to imperial prosperity, had become an arithmetic of despair. The Egyptian grain ships that should have arrived with their holds bulging, with the Nile Delta's golden harvest, limped into the Golden Horn, carrying little more than empty promises, and crews who spoke of crop failures that defied all precedent. Captain Nikephoros, whose family had transported Egyptian grain to Constantinople for 3 generations, stood before imperial officials with the hollow-eyed expression of a man who had witnessed the collapse of natural law itself. "The granaries of Alexandria stand empty, Majesty," he reported, his voice carrying the weight of catastrophe that transcended personal failure. "The river's flood failed, the seedlings died in the fields, and what little grain remains feeds barely half the population of Egypt itself. We carried what we could, perhaps 2 days' supply for the city's poorest districts, but there will be no more ships until harvests return, if they ever do." Within days of this pronouncement, the Augustan Forum erupted in violence that made previous civil disturbances seem like children's games. The bread riots that convulsed the city centre were led not by professional agitators or factional politicians, but by ordinary citizens whose children had begun to cry with the particular desperation that comes from bellies that remember food but no longer expect it. Patrician matrons who had never soiled their silk-shod feet in common streets found themselves shoulder to shoulder with dock workers and tavern keepers, united in rage that transcended class boundaries. They hurled stones at imperial guards whose own families faced identical starvation, screaming demands for bread that no earthly authority possessed the power to fulfill. The guards, trained to suppress urban disorder with professional efficiency, hesitated to use full force against crowds that included their own neighbors and relatives. Justinian opened the imperial reserves with the reluctance of a man who understood that this gesture, however necessary, represented the beginning of the end rather than a solution to the crisis. The grain stored in the palace vaults, enough to feed the court and essential personnel for months under normal circumstances, would sustain the general population for perhaps 3 weeks if distributed with scrupulous equality. But distribution proved impossible to manage with the precision that survival demanded. Senators who had spent decades perfecting the arts of political manipulation discovered that influence meant nothing when the fundamental currency of existence had vanished. Aristocrats who could command fleets and armies found themselves powerless to acquire the loaves that their servants' children needed to live through another day. Citizens began reporting visions that previous generations would have dismissed as fever dreams or heretical fantasy. In the bronze twilight that had replaced normal daylight, figures danced along rooftops and through narrow streets. Demons, angels, or merely hallucinations born of hunger and desperation. Old women swore they had seen Saint Michael himself walking the city walls, his flaming sword cutting through air that tasted of sulfur and approaching death. These supernatural sightings multiplied as malnutrition weakened bodies and minds that had never been tested by genuine privation. Constantinople's population, accustomed to abundance that seemed as reliable as sunrise, proved psychologically unprepared for scarcity that challenged their understanding of how the world was supposed to function. The blue and green circus factions, whose rivalry had sparked civil wars and toppled emperors, achieved something unprecedented in Byzantine history: complete unity of purpose in demanding the impossible. Their leaders, men whose entire careers had been built on exploiting factional division, found themselves addressing crowds that acknowledged no loyalty except to empty stomachs and dying children. "Give us bread, or give us honest graves," they chanted in voices that echoed through streets where normal commerce had ceased to function. The hippodrome, where their followers had once fought, pitched battles over chariot racing, remained empty except for gatherings where desperate people shared rumors of hidden grain stores or ships that might arrive with salvation from distant lands. Imperial soldiers, the backbone of order that kept the empire functioning, began deserting their posts when their own grain rations failed to arrive. Men who had sworn oaths to defend the crown unto death discovered that such oaths meant little when their wives wrote letters describing children who no longer had strength to cry. Entire units abandoned their barracks during night watches, slipping away to countryside that offered no real hope, but at least promised reunion with families who would face starvation together. Belisarius returned from his Gothic campaigns to find the city he had left in celebration transformed into something that resembled conquered territories more than the triumphant capital of a resurgent empire. The general whose tactical genius had restored Roman Africa and reclaimed Italy for imperial rule stood in streets where his victories meant nothing, beside the simple fact that bread could not be purchased at any price. His soldiers, veterans who had faced Gothic spears and Vandal cavalry with disciplined courage, looked to him for solutions that military science could not provide. How do you defeat an enemy that attacks from the stratosphere? How do you negotiate with volcanic forces that acknowledge no diplomatic protocol? How do you feed an army when the earth itself has forgotten how to grow food? Empress Theodora, whose own childhood in Constantinople's poorest districts had taught her lessons about hunger that aristocratic birth could never provide, organized soup kitchens with the efficiency that had once characterized imperial military campaigns. Using her personal household funds and whatever grain could be diverted from official reserves, she established feeding stations in churches throughout the city. But even imperial charity proved inadequate against the scale of need that confronted Constantinople's population. The kitchens that Theodora funded could feed thousands, but the city contained hundreds of thousands. Children who received one meal at an imperial soup kitchen returned to homes where parents had not eaten for days, their sacrifice ensuring that the next generation might survive even if the present one perished. In the underground cisterns that had once stored water for siege defense, wealthy families began hoarding grain with the secrecy that previous generations had reserved for treasonous correspondence. Senators whose grandfathers had survived barbarian invasions through careful preparation now accumulated supplies that could sustain their households through months of famine, while their former clients and dependents faced immediate starvation. The progression of desperation followed patterns that would become grimly familiar across the civilized world. First, the poor consumed their domestic animals. Dogs and cats that had been companions became sources of protein that might sustain life for another few days. Then, leather goods, shoes, belts, harnesses, found their way into cooking pots where they were boiled until they achieved a consistency that desperate stomachs could process. When leather disappeared, bark became the next resort. The plane trees that lined Constantinople's avenues were stripped of their outer covering by crowds that cooked the fibrous material into a porridge that provided bulk, if not nutrition. Then came grass, weeds, anything that grew in the cracks between paving stones, or in the neglected corners of once magnificent gardens. The churches of Constantinople, those monuments to imperial Christian triumph, overflowed with desperate prayers that seemed to echo unanswered in spaces where divine intervention had once been considered reliable. Hagia Sophia, still under construction, but already functioning as the city's greatest sanctuary, witnessed liturgies attended by congregations whose faith was tested by circumstances that challenged every assumption about divine providence. Patriarch Menas, whose sermons had once focused on theological subtleties and ecclesiastical politics, found himself attempting to explain why God had permitted such suffering to fall upon the most Christian city in the world. His words, crafted with rhetorical skill, developed through decades of theological training, sounded hollow in spaces where starving children interrupted services with cries that no homily could comfort. As winter approached, though in this new world the seasons themselves had lost their familiar meanings, Constantinople the Great, the new Rome, the eternal city that had seemed destined to outlast all earthly kingdoms, slowly consumed itself under skies that had forgotten how to provide the light and warmth that made civilized life possible. In the east, the unraveling came with the precision of a cruel joke, as though unseen forces had decreed that civilizations blind to each other's worth should nonetheless die as equals in ruin. Khosrow, Anushirvan, he whose epithet meant the immortal soul, stood in the fire temple at Ctesiphon, watching sacred flames that had burned without interruption since the founding of the Sassanid dynasty struggle against forces that his Zoroastrian theology had never prepared him to comprehend. The king, whose administrative genius had created the most efficiently governed empire in the world, found himself presiding over dissolution that mocked every achievement of his 20-year reign. The eternal fire of Atur-Gushnasp, which had blazed as a symbol of divine favor since Ardashir first proclaimed himself King of Kings, flickered with the uncertainty of a candle in wind. Priests who had tended these flames through wars and famines, earthquakes and eclipses, watched in growing terror as the sacred light that connected earth to heaven wavered like the faith of mortals confronting evidence of cosmic betrayal. Angra Mainyu has wounded Ahura Mazda himself, whispered Kartir, the fire priest, his voice carrying the hollow certainty of a man whose theological universe had collapsed along with the natural order. The Lord of Light bleeds in heaven's highest realm, and his sacred fires fail on earth as divine strength ebbs like blood from a mortal wound. The complex Qanat irrigation systems that had transformed Persian deserts into gardens worthy of paradise began their own surrender to forces beyond hydraulic engineering. These underground channels, tunneled through hundreds of miles of rock and sand by engineers whose expertise had been accumulated over centuries, carried mountains snowmelt to cities that bloomed in landscapes where rainfall was measured in drops rather than inches. But the mountains that fed these systems had ceased to function according to principles that Persian watermasters understood. The snowpack that should have accumulated during winter months had failed to materialize in sufficient quantity, while the springs that emerged from high passes ran thin as whispers, carrying barely enough water to sustain the herds of nomads who lived at the empire's edges, much less the great cities that required abundant water for fountains, baths, and the agricultural surpluses that sustained urban populations. Mazandaran, the province whose very name meant land of abundant water, watched its rivers dwindle to streams, its streams to trickles, its trickles to memories carved in empty channels that had once carried enough flow to turn the mill wheels that ground grain for royal granaries. The paradise gardens that Persian poets celebrated in verses destined to outlast the civilization that created them became monuments to horticultural hubris, their geometric perfection maintained by groundskeepers who poured precious water on plants that died despite their ministrations. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles to the southeast, Emperor Vishnugupta of the Gupta dynasty watched his own empire's dissolution from a palace in Pataliputra that commanded the confluence of rivers that had fed Indian civilization since time immemorial. The Ganges, sacred to millions who believed its waters could wash away the sins of lifetimes, flowed at half its normal volume, while the mighty Indus, that river whose very name had given India to the world, barely maintained enough current to support the boat traffic that connected the subcontinent's scattered kingdoms. The monsoons that had governed subcontinental life with astronomical reliability arrived weak and sporadic, their rain-bearing clouds dispersed by atmospheric patterns that the volcanic veil had disrupted across the entire planet. Farmers whose ancestors had planted, according to monsoon timing, for 3 millennia, stood in fields where the seasonal rains that should have arrived with calendar precision came instead as scattered showers that tantalized crops without providing adequate moisture for growth. Sanskrit astronomers whose mathematical precision had calculated eclipses decades in advance found their meteorological knowledge useless against a climate that had abandoned every pattern their science recognized. The Surya Siddhanta, those astronomical texts that had guided Indian agriculture through countless seasons, became as obsolete as bronze weapons in an iron age. In both empires, the military forces that had maintained order across vast territories began their own disintegration, as soldiers abandoned their posts to search for families who faced starvation without their protection. Persian immortals, the elite guard whose name proclaimed their invincibility, deserted from frontier fortresses where they had held the line against nomadic incursions for generations. Their disciplined ranks, once the terror of Roman legions and Central Asian horsemen alike, dissolved like salt in water, as men whose courage had never failed on conventional battlefields chose family survival over military honor. Gupta armies that had maintained the empire's dominance over the subcontinent's richest territories found themselves powerless against an enemy that could not be charged with cavalry or outflanked through tactical brilliance. Generals whose reputations had been built on victories against the White Huns discovered that strategic genius meant nothing when the fundamental challenge was securing enough grain to feed troops whose loyalty depended on regular rations. The treasuries that had sustained these empires through previous crises, Persian silver mines that had produced currency for international commerce, Indian gold reserves that had funded temple construction and scholarly patronage, proved useless when the basic problem was not monetary but existential. Coins minted with royal portraits and divine blessings could not purchase grain that had never grown, could not import food from regions where identical crop failures had created universal scarcity. In Babylon's Jewish quarter, where communities had maintained their distinct identity since Nebuchadnezzar's deportations, aged scholars found disturbing confirmation of prophecies they had hoped would remain allegorical forever. The book of Daniel's visions of cosmic judgment, of empires that would crumble like clay mixed with iron, seemed to unfold in contemporary reality with frightening precision. Rabbi Shimeon ben Gamaliel, whose family had preserved Talmudic learning through centuries of Persian tolerance, gathered his disciples in study halls where hunger made concentration nearly impossible. "The fourth kingdom approaches its end," he whispered, referring to interpretations that identified Persia as the final empire before the Messiah's arrival. "The signs are clear. Sun darkened, harvests failed. The righteous suffer alongside the wicked, as it is written." Hindu priests throughout the Gupta territories proclaimed that the Kali Yuga, the final age of darkness before cosmic renewal, had begun with unmistakable signs. The Dharma that had sustained social order for millennia weakened as traditional obligations became impossible to fulfill when basic survival demanded abandoning conventional morality. Sacred texts that prescribed elaborate rituals for royal ceremonies became irrelevant when kings could no longer command the resources necessary for simple governance. Buddhist monasteries that had accumulated grain supplies through generations of careful management found themselves besieged by crowds of lay devotees whose desperation transcended religious protocol. Abbots who had spent lifetimes contemplating the Four Noble Truths discovered that the first truth, that existence entails suffering, had acquired immediacy that their philosophical training had not prepared them to address. The Jetavana monastery at Shravasti, where the Buddha himself had supposedly spent many rainy seasons teaching the Dharma, opened its granaries to lay communities and watched centuries of accumulated wealth disappear in weeks. Monks who had renounced worldly concerns found themselves administrating relief efforts that required exactly the kind of material calculation they had entered religious life to escape. The Great Silk Road that connected these dying empires shriveled from both ends simultaneously, as demand for luxury goods collapsed in regions where populations struggled to secure basic nutrition. Caravans that had carried Chinese silk to Persian markets, Indian spices to Roman tables, and Persian silver to Chinese courts, found themselves without customers who could afford anything beyond immediate sustenance. Tamil merchant ships that had maintained trading relationships across the Indian Ocean for centuries abandoned routes that no longer generated sufficient profit to justify their risks. The cosmopolitan world that had connected civilizations from Ireland to Indonesia through networks of commercial exchange began its contraction into isolated communities focused on local survival rather than international prosperity. Two of humanity's oldest continuous civilizations, Persia, heir to Mesopotamian traditions that stretched back to Sumer, and India, whose cultural continuity linked the Harappan cities to contemporary kingdoms, collapsed in parallel, their accumulated wisdom of millennia proving inadequate against forces that had never been recorded in their most comprehensive historical chronicles. Heaven's displeasure had never manifested with such unmistakable clarity, not even in the dark years when the Han dynasty collapsed, or when barbarian invasions shattered the unity of the Middle Kingdom. For in those calamities, the sun at least had continued to shine with proper celestial authority. The Northern Wei dynasty, which had ruled from Luoyang, with the confidence born of military success and administrative competence, discovered that earthly achievements meant nothing when heaven itself withdrew its sanction in the most literal way imaginable. Emperor Xiaoming, whose reign had been marked by territorial expansion and cultural flowering, found himself presiding over an empire that fractured like pottery dropped on stone as local governors interpreted the darkened sky as irrefutable evidence that the mandate had passed elsewhere. In the imperial archives, where generations of court historians had maintained the most meticulous records on Earth, scribes whose brushstrokes had preserved the rise and fall of dynasties faced the challenge of documenting catastrophe that exceeded the vocabulary that Chinese civilization had developed for describing political collapse. Their bamboo strips and silk scrolls, inscribed with characters whose meanings had remained stable for centuries, now carried descriptions of phenomena that would have been dismissed as fantasy if witnessed by fewer observers. In the 9th year of the Xiaoming era, wrote Grand Historian Liu Jiji, with the precision that duty demanded, the sun's virtue diminished to 1/3 its normal strength, casting shadows where no shadows should fall, and bringing cold where warmth should reign. Yellow dust falls from heaven itself, carrying the taste of distant fires and the scent of mountains ground to powder by forces beyond human comprehension. These yellow dust storms differed from the familiar low-S winds that had shaped northern China's landscape since time immemorial. Where natural dust carried the earthy smell of soil disturbed by seasonal weather, this aerial invasion bore the metallic tang of sulfur, the acrid bite of acids that burned the throat and brought tears to eyes that had never wept at atmospheric phenomena. When mixed with saliva, it left a residue that suggested proximity to furnaces operating at temperatures no earthly forge had ever achieved. Court astronomers, whose families had served successive dynasties for centuries, took measurements with bronze instruments crafted by artisans whose techniques represented the accumulated precision of generations. Their calculations confirmed what eyes could observe, but minds struggled to accept. Celestial mechanics continued to operate with mathematical reliability, yet the sun's essential nature had been fundamentally altered by forces that lay beyond the reach of astronomical theory. Master Kong Lingfu, whose grandfather had compiled star charts for the previous dynasty, stood in the imperial observatory, surrounded by astrolabes and armillary spheres that had never failed to predict eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and seasonal changes with accuracy that proved heaven's fundamental orderliness. Now these instruments, still mechanically perfect, measured a cosmos that had abandoned its predictable behavior. The sun of heaven's virtue has been found wanting, he whispered to disciples whose training had prepared them for dynastic transitions, but not for cosmic rebellion. Heaven speaks through the sun's weakness, declaring that the mandate must pass to worthier hands, though where such hands might be found in a world that suffers equally from sea to sea, remains hidden from mortal sight. The Yellow River, already prone to catastrophic course changes that had earned it the epithet China's Sorrow, shifted its path with the timing of divine judgment. Dikes that had channeled its flow for centuries burst without warning, sending torrents across farmland that had been made fertile through generations of careful irrigation management. Entire districts that had prospered through proximity to controlled water access found themselves flooded out of existence, while regions that had depended on river-fed canals were left high and dry as the changed course abandoned infrastructure that represented centuries of hydraulic engineering. Governor Wei Xiaoquan of Shanxi province, whose family had served the imperial administration since the dynasty's founding, received reports that read like inventories of apocalypse. Villages that had paid taxes for decades had vanished beneath muddy waters that carried no promise of eventual recession. Granaries built to withstand siege warfare had been swept away by floods that exceeded every previous record of the river's destructive capacity. That marvel of engineering, the Grand Canal, no longer bore grain to the north, but only empty vessels gliding like coffins through a silent economy. bargemen whose fathers and grandfathers had maintained the crucial supply lines that fed imperial armies, and court populations found themselves transporting nothing but increasingly desperate messages between provincial administrators who competed for resources that no longer existed in sufficient quantities. In the Confucian academies, where scholars had debated the principles of virtuous governance for centuries, heated discussions erupted over questions that would have been theoretical under normal circumstances. If heaven withdrew its mandate through natural disasters, did this necessarily indicate moral failure on the emperor's part? Could virtuous rule prevent volcanic catastrophe that originated beyond the Middle Kingdom's borders? How should competing claimants demonstrate their worthiness to receive celestial approval when the sun itself seemed to have abandoned earthly concerns entirely? Master Li Daoyuan, whose commentaries on classical texts had established his reputation as the dynasty's foremost Confucian philosopher, found himself defending positions that circumstances had made untenable. The emperor's virtue extends through all creation. He had taught for decades, interpreting ancient texts that connected moral leadership to cosmic harmony. Now students demanded explanations for suffering that transcended any individual ruler's capacity to influence or control. Buddhist monks, whose foreign doctrine had gradually gained acceptance at court and in major cities, proclaimed that the Dharma-ending age had arrived precisely as their scriptures predicted. The Dharma-ending age, Mofa, when Buddha's teachings would lose their power to provide liberation, and the world would descend into spiritual darkness that paralleled the physical dimming of celestial light. Abbot Faxian of the White Horse Temple, whose monastery had preserved Sanskrit texts through previous dynastic transitions, gathered his community in the main hall, where gilded Buddhas gazed serenely at congregations whose serenity had been shattered by circumstances that proved the impermanence of all conditioned existence. "The Kalpa draws to its close," he announced with the calm authority that came from lifetimes spent contemplating the inevitability of cosmic cycles. The Buddha's Dharma weakens as predicted, and humanity must endure the consequences of accumulated karma from countless ages of ignorance and attachment. Taoist hermits, who had retreated to mountain caves and forest hermitages, emerged from seclusion to proclaim that the natural harmony between heaven and earth had been disrupted by human interference in cosmic processes. Their alchemical experiments, designed to create elixirs of immortality through the proper combination of mercury and sulfur, had revealed disturbing correlations between their laboratory failures and the atmospheric poison that fell from skies they had once considered pure. Across the provinces, warlords proclaimed themselves heirs to heaven's shifting mandate, each insisting that the catastrophe proved their land had been marked for salvation, while neighbors paid for sins long unatoned. In Shandong, General Gao Huan announced that the eastern regions would secede from imperial authority that had proven incapable of maintaining basic cosmic order. In Sichuan, Governor Xiaobayan proclaimed himself king of the western domains, claiming that his successful organization of famine relief demonstrated celestial approval for independent rule. The Middle Kingdom, which had maintained its cultural unity through political fragmentations that stretched back to the Warring States period, shattered into pieces that would not be reassembled for generations. Each fragment insisted on its legitimacy, while ruling over territories where legitimacy itself had become meaningless, in the face of starvation that acknowledged no political boundaries. In villages throughout the empire, families began selling children for handfuls of millet in transactions that violated every principle of Confucian social order. Parents who had been taught that filial obligations formed the foundation of civilized society found themselves choosing between honor and survival in calculations that no ethical system had prepared them to make. For over 1,000 years, the Middle Kingdom had stood at the center of the world, but now it disintegrated, and heaven's mandate passed to those who could prove it, not with words, but with food enough to endure the cosmic night. In the high valleys of central Mexico, where 200,000 souls had built the greatest city in the Americas, the maize began to die in cold that had never touched this latitude since the last ice age retreated into memory older than human civilization itself. Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born, stretched across the valley floor like a vision of cosmic order made manifest in stone and mortar. Its pyramids aligned with celestial movements that had governed Mesoamerican life since the first farmers learned to read the sky's seasonal messages. The Pyramid of the Sun, rising 200 feet above the Avenue of the Dead, had been positioned to catch the rising star Aldebaran at precisely the moment when planting should begin, its shadow falling across ceremonial plazas where priests had performed rituals designed to ensure agricultural abundance for centuries beyond counting. But the cosmic machinery that connected earthly ceremonies to celestial powers had broken with the completeness that characterizes divine abandonment. The high priest, heir to a lineage that had served the feathered serpent since the city's founding, stood upon the pyramid of the moon, watching fields of maize wither black beneath a cold no season had ever named. The young corn plants, those green children of the earth goddess who had sustained Mesoamerican civilization since its inception, withered in soil that had forgotten how to provide the warmth that transformed seed into sustenance. Ears that should have been swelling with kernels hung limp from stalks that had lost their structural integrity. The life force that connected plant to cosmic source, severed by forces that operated beyond the reach of agricultural wisdom, accumulated over millennia. His priests gathered around him in the pre-dawn darkness that had replaced normal sunrise, their obsidian knives glinting in torchlight as they prepared for ceremonies that grew more desperate with each passing day. The rituals that had once required carefully measured bloodletting, a few drops from royal earlobes, the precisely timed heart extraction of captured warriors, now demanded hundreds of lives, offered to powers that seemed increasingly distant from earthly concerns. Quetzalcoatl has turned his face from us, whispered the priest, her voice carrying the hollow certainty of one whose theological universe had collapsed with the natural order. The feathered serpent who brought us maize, who gave us the calendar of time, who promised abundance through ritual. He has gone across the eastern sea, leaving us to the darkness. The great chinampas, those floating gardens that had been engineering marvels rivaling anything achieved in Egypt or Mesopotamia, became monuments to agricultural hubris as unprecedented cold froze solid the lake waters that had sustained their intricate ecosystem. These artificial islands, constructed from mud and aquatic vegetation, with precision that required generations of hydraulic knowledge, had fed multitudes through careful integration of aquaculture and agriculture that made maximum use of every available resource. The master gardener, descended from generations who had tended the same chinampas, stood knee-deep in ice that had formed overnight around plants unprepared for anything below tropical warmth. The intricate canal systems, once masters of water and temperature, were powerless before the cosmic forces that had overturned the climate itself. Tomatoes, beans, and squash, the sacred triad that accompanied maize in sustaining Mesoamerican populations, lay frozen in their growing beds, their cellular structure destroyed by ice crystals that had formed inside living tissue. The chilies that added flavor to ritual feasts had turned black overnight, their capsaicin-rich fruits now containing only the bitter taste of vegetation that had died while still reaching toward a sun that no longer provided adequate warmth. The obsidian trade networks that had connected Teotihuacan to regions from Guatemala to Arizona collapsed as every urban center focused resources on immediate survival rather than the long-distance commerce that had sustained Mesoamerican prosperity for centuries. Merchants who had transported volcanic glass weapons and tools across thousands of miles of mountain and desert found themselves without customers who could afford anything beyond basic necessities required for day-to-day existence. In the workshops where artisans had crafted obsidian blades sharper than modern surgical instruments, master craftsmen whose techniques represented the accumulated expertise of generations now devoted their skills to creating knives for sacrificial ceremonies that demanded ever-increasing offerings to powers that remained unmoved by human desperation. Refugees flooded into the city from rural areas where death came faster than in urban environments, with their accumulated food stores and organized distribution systems. Farming villages throughout the basin of Mexico emptied as populations sought sanctuary in Teotihuacan's ceremonial precincts, swelling the great city beyond its capacity to sustain additional inhabitants, even under normal circumstances. The apartment compounds that had housed extended families in comfortable prosperity became overcrowded death traps where disease spread with the efficiency that close quarters and malnutrition always provide. Entire room blocks that had been designed for 20 inhabitants now sheltered 50, their shared patios and courtyards becoming breeding grounds for illnesses that overwhelmed immune systems weakened by inadequate nutrition. Maya cities to the south and east reported identical catastrophe through the long-distance communication networks that had connected Mesoamerican urban centers for generations. Tikal, Palenque, Copan, all the great ceremonial complexes that had raised limestone pyramids toward heaven in emulation of Teotihuacan's achievements, faced the same agricultural collapse, the same desperate resort to mass sacrifice, the same theological crisis that challenged fundamental assumptions about the cosmic contracts that bound divine powers to human communities. The ball courts that had served as venues for ritualized competition, representing cosmic struggles between forces of light and darkness, stood empty as communities could no longer spare the resources required for ceremonies that demanded elaborate preparation and substantial offerings. The rubber balls that had symbolized the sun's daily journey across heavenly realms gathered dust in storage chambers where priests had once prepared for games whose outcomes influenced seasonal weather patterns and agricultural success. Along the Avenue of the Dead, that great ceremonial thoroughfare that connected the city's major temples in a cosmic map rendered in architecture and urban planning, funeral pyres burned continuously as the mortality rate climbed beyond the capacity of traditional burial practices to accommodate. Bodies that should have been interred with the ritual attention that honored ancestral spirits instead fed flames that consumed the city's wooden structures to provide fuel for cremations that never ended. The avenue that had earned its modern name from Spanish conquistadors who mistook apartment buildings for tombs now justified that designation through the literal presence of death that stalked its length, day and night. The great city that had been conceived as an earthly reflection of celestial harmony became a vast necropolis where the living served primarily as attendants for the dying. If the volcanic eruption at Ilopango in nearby El Salvador had indeed triggered the atmospheric catastrophe that darkened skies across the planet, then Mesoamerican civilization faced the cruelest irony imaginable: destruction by forces originating from within their own geographical sphere, perhaps even from mountains their ancestors had considered sacred. The gods had not been defeated by foreign powers, but had turned against their own people with weapons drawn from the earth's molten depths. Teotihuacan's classic period, that golden age of architectural achievement and artistic flowering, that had established patterns for Mesoamerican urban development ended not in conquest by rival cities, but in abandonment by cosmic forces that had once seemed reliably committed to human prosperity. The feathered serpent's departure left behind only silence, where once the greatest city in the Americas had pulsed with the rhythms of civilization confident in its divine sanction. Across the forests of Scandinavia, where summers had long been fleeting but predictable, the barley and rye that nourished northern communities froze in the height of their season, their crystalline stalks rising like monuments to the futility of cultivation. The tree rings that would be discovered by dendrochronologists more than a millennium later preserve the testimony of ancient oaks whose growth simply stopped during these years. These giants that had weathered centuries of normal climate variation added nothing to their circumference between 536 and 539, their cambium layers recording the most severe growth disruption in their multi-century lifespans. The trees did not die. They endured, but in a state of suspended animation that spoke of conditions beyond the parameters of survival they had previously encountered. The Baltic Sea, that relatively shallow body of water that had never frozen completely even during the harshest winters in living memory, developed ice sheets that persisted into what calendars insisted was summer. Ships that had departed northern ports before the crisis struck found themselves trapped in harbors where ice had formed with unprecedented thickness and refused to melt according to seasonal expectations that had governed maritime activity for generations. The period saw coastal trading posts, prosperous for centuries, suddenly abandoned as their inhabitants retreated inland when the sustaining sea turned hostile. The amber routes tying Scandinavia to the Mediterranean collapsed completely, for commerce could not endure where populations fought for basic subsistence. In Britain, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the period with stark brevity. The sun was dim and without radiance, and fruits did not ripen. These terse entries, preserved in monasteries where scribes maintained careful records of unusual events, document what contemporary sources called the year without summer, followed by 2 additional years of killing cold that transformed the landscape's agricultural potential. Irish monasteries, those centers of learning that had preserved classical knowledge through previous periods of political upheaval, faced raids from clans whose Christianity had been overcome by starvation's more immediate demands. The annals of Ulster record attacks on religious communities that had previously been considered inviolate, their grain stores and livestock making them targets for populations whose traditional sources of sustenance had failed completely. In Scotland, Pictish communities abandoned their lowland settlements and withdrew to ancient hill forts, unused since the Roman invasions centuries before. These sites bear signs of hurried reoccupation in the mid-6th century, their defences hastily rebuilt and expanded to shelter those fleeing farmlands where cultivation had failed. Gothic tribes that controlled some of Europe's most fertile territories in former Roman provinces found themselves facing starvation despite occupying lands that had fed empires. The military advantages that had enabled their conquest of Roman territories proved meaningless against an enemy that attacked through atmospheric manipulation rather than conventional warfare. Finnish oral traditions preserve references to the Fimbulwinter from their oldest cosmological narratives, 3 consecutive years of harsh cold that would precede Ragnarok, the end of the world. The correlation between these ancient prophecies and the actual climate conditions experienced during the 536 to 539 period suggests that previous volcanic winters may have shaped Northern European mythology in ways that provided conceptual frameworks for understanding cosmic catastrophe. The fishing communities that dotted Scandinavia's extensive coastlines initially fared better than agricultural settlements, but even marine resources proved inadequate, as cold water disrupted spawning grounds and altered the migration patterns of species that coastal populations had relied upon for generations. Fish populations that had sustained northern communities since the retreat of the last ice age either died in waters too cold for their survival or migrated to latitudes where their traditional predators could not follow. In this era, European burial traditions were transformed. Cremation disappeared, replaced by simple inhumation, not from religious pressure, but because wood was required to warm the living and prepare food rather than feed funeral fires. The social transformations that emerged from these desperate conditions would reshape Northern European civilization for centuries. Communities that had been primarily agricultural began developing the maritime technologies and raiding strategies that would eventually characterize Viking expansion. The long-ship designs that would terrorize coastal settlements from Ireland to Byzantium originated in this period of necessity when populations could no longer sustain themselves through farming and were forced to seek resources through seaborne expeditions. Settlement patterns from the late 6th century reveal the widespread abandonment of marginal farmlands as populations drew together in places that provided stronger defenses and more reliable food sources. The dispersed farming communities that had characterized much of Northern Europe since the Roman withdrawal gave way to more centralized settlements that could better organize collective survival strategies. The demographic impact of these 3 years of climate catastrophe was severe enough to alter the genetic composition of Northern European populations. Studies of ancient DNA samples suggest significant population bottlenecks during this period, with some communities experiencing mortality rates that approached societal collapse. The survivors who rebuilt these societies carried cultural adaptations that emphasized mobility, naval expertise, and the warrior ethos that would later define the Viking Age. Between 536 and 539, the trade systems binding Europe to the Mediterranean fell apart and did not recover for generations. The flow of Roman goods northward in exchange for amber and furs simply ended as survival eclipsed trade. The linguistic evidence preserved in Old Norse literature suggests that vocabulary related to famine, cold, and societal collapse expanded significantly during this period, with new terms entering Northern European languages to describe conditions that had no precedent in collective memory. Words for specific types of starvation, for the social breakdown that accompanies resource scarcity, and for the desperate measures that survival sometimes requires, became permanent additions to linguistic systems that reflected the community's traumatic adaptation to impossible circumstances. Northern Europe entered a period of cultural transformation that would not reach completion for 3 centuries. The confident agricultural societies that had emerged from the Roman collapse were replaced by populations whose collective memory of this catastrophe shaped their approach to resource acquisition, social organization, and technological development. The disappeared sun had not merely disrupted growing seasons, it had fundamentally altered the trajectory of Northern European civilization, creating the conditions that would eventually produce the maritime raiders who would reshape medieval history through their expansion across the North Atlantic and into the river systems of Eastern Europe. From the Arctic tundra to the southern tip of Chile, the volcanic winter that had darkened skies over the Old World brought identical catastrophe to populations who had no knowledge of Mediterranean empires or Asian dynasties, yet whose suffering would prove equally devastating and far more isolated. In the coastal valleys of Peru, where the Moche civilization had flourished for centuries through sophisticated irrigation systems and monumental architecture, the El Niño patterns that governed Andean climate underwent disruptions that transformed predictable seasonal cycles into chaotic alternations between devastating floods and killing droughts. The great adobe pyramids that had dominated valley landscapes for generations stood abandoned as populations fled regions where agricultural systems had supported complex societies since time immemorial. The irrigation networks that had sustained Moche agriculture, engineering achievements that rivaled contemporary Roman aqueducts in their sophistication, became useless when climate patterns shifted beyond the parameters their designers had anticipated. Channels that had carried mountain runoff to coastal fields with hydraulic precision found themselves either overwhelmed by unprecedented floods or left dry when expected seasonal flows failed to materialize, according to meteorological patterns that had governed Andean life since the world was young. Along the Mississippi River Valley, where woodland cultures had developed sophisticated agricultural systems based on indigenous crop varieties, the carefully cultivated plants that had sustained dense populations simply disappeared from the landscape during the catastrophic years. The managed ecosystems that had supported thriving communities along major river systems throughout eastern North America underwent transformations that left once fertile regions empty of both crops and the people who had tended them. North of the Great Isthmus, indigenous populations from the desert-dwelling Anasazi to the mound-building peoples of the Ohio River Valley experienced simultaneous agricultural collapse that no individual farming community could have predicted or prepared for. The maize, beans, and squash that had sustained millions of people across diverse North American environments, the sacred triad that natives called the Three Sisters, failed together in a coordinated catastrophe that suggested divine displeasure on a cosmic scale. The great pueblos that had risen like stone cities from the southwestern canyons fell silent during these years of darkness. Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and dozens of other population centers that had buzzed with the activity of thousands saw their inhabitants scatter to the winds when the agricultural abundance that had made such concentrations possible simply ceased to exist. The elaborate kivas, where priests had performed ceremonies to ensure seasonal rains, echoed empty, their rituals apparently powerless against forces that operated beyond the reach of earthly supplication. In the Amazon basin, where even minor changes in light penetration could affect the complex ecological balance that sustained rainforest communities, traditional food sources underwent disruptions that challenged knowledge systems. Forest peoples had developed through countless generations of careful observation, the intricate understanding of plant cycles and animal behavior that had enabled humans to thrive in one of Earth's most demanding environments proved inadequate when the forest itself began behaving according to rules no shaman had ever encountered. The Nazca people of coastal Peru, who had carved their great line drawings into desert pavements where they would remain visible to sky gods for millennia, intensified their ceremonial activities as fields that had never failed began producing nothing but withered stalks. Their pottery from these desperate years shows increasing emphasis on religious imagery, the painted vessels telling stories of communities that had turned entirely to supernatural solutions when natural ones proved insufficient. Throughout the Andes, societies that had survived periodic crop failures through sophisticated food preservation techniques, freeze-drying potatoes at high altitude, maintaining surplus grain in stone-lined repositories built into cliffsides, watched helplessly as even these insurance systems proved inadequate against the duration and severity of the climate disruption. Storage facilities that had contained enough preserved food to sustain entire communities through multiple years of scarcity stood empty within months of the Great Darkening. Communities facing complete agricultural collapse turned to practices that spoke of absolute desperation. in the high mountains where snow should have accumulated to feed the rivers that watered valley crops. Ceremonies took place that included the sacrifice of children, whose perfect bodies might convince the mountain spirits to restore the natural cycles that had sustained human life since the ancestors first learned to plant seeds in Andean soil. The vast trade routes of North America, carrying volcanic glass across thousands of miles, shells from distant seas to inland cultures, and copper from the northern lakes into southern valleys, where it was worked into ornaments of power, broke apart during the years of darkness, when every community turned inward to survival and could no longer sustain the luxuries of exchange. Across ancient America, cities emptied as though their foundations had cracked and all life poured out. The Corral civilization of coastal Peru, after more than 1,000 years of monumental building and far-reaching trade, vanished in the chaos. Their carefully planned urban centers, with their sunken plazas and pyramid complexes, were abandoned to the desert winds that soon covered them with sand that would hide them from human eyes for more than a millennium. From the Inuit communities of the far north to the peoples who lived at the world's southern edge in what would one day be called Tierra del Fuego, populations faced identical challenges: crops that would not grow, animals that had fled to unknown refuges, weather patterns that bore no resemblance to the seasonal cycles that had governed human activity since the first migrations brought people to the Americas tens of thousands of years earlier. Dozens of tribal traditions, carried in languages as diverse as their homelands, told of the time when the sun failed to shine, as it should. Only after centuries did outsiders record the tales and recognize them as fragments of one great disaster. Children who survived the Hunger Years would carry the memory in their bones, passing down to their own children and grandchildren an understanding that the world's stability was never guaranteed, that abundance could disappear as quickly as morning mist, that survival sometimes demanded choices that violated every principle of civilized life. Cut off from the wider world, the peoples of the Americas faced their long winter, without realizing that identical despair shadowed every continent. They turned to their own stories to explain the catastrophe, never suspecting that far away, in Constantinople and Ctesiphon, in Luoyang and Pataliputra, others battled the same darkness and hunger. The absent sun created a single suffering planet, but each community experienced it as if cursed in isolation. Never in human memory had all the world's gods fallen silent at once. In Constantinople's greatest churches, where gold mosaics caught what little light filtered through the bronze sky, congregations gathered for liturgies that felt like funeral rites for faith itself. The Hagia Sophia, that monument to Christ's triumph over earthly powers, echoed with prayers that seemed to bounce off its soaring dome and fall back to earth unanswered. Priests whose voices had once carried the confidence of divine authority now stammered through services where children interrupted with cries that no sermon could quiet. The bread that should have transformed into Christ's body during the Eucharist had become impossible to bake, when yeast itself had died in the unnatural cold. Holy water blessed according to ancient rites provided no healing for diseases that multiplied in bodies weakened by starvation. Christian chroniclers of the period wrote with bewildered pen strokes about signs that seemed to fulfill the darkest prophecies, while contradicting every promise of divine protection. The sun that had been creation's first light now gave illumination without warmth, while the earth that God had pronounced good brought forth nothing but withered crops and empty granaries. In Persia's fire temples, flames that had burned since the empire's founding guttered despite constant tending. Zoroastrian priests who had maintained these eternal fires through wars and earthquakes watched their sacred charges dimmed to embers that threatened to die entirely. The cosmic battle between light and darkness that formed the center of their faith seemed to have shifted decisively toward shadow. Persian magi, who had confidently predicted the triumph of Ahura Mazda over all forces of destruction, found their theology tested by darkness that lasted longer than any eclipse, cold that persisted beyond any natural winter. The dualistic faith that had made sense when good and evil appeared to be balanced now seemed naive when evil had gained such obvious advantage. Throughout India, Brahmins performed the same rituals their ancestors had conducted for 1,000 years, yet the gods remained deaf to supplications that had never before gone unanswered. The elaborate fire sacrifices continued according to precise requirements, with correct mantras chanted at proper times, but Indra sent no rain, Agni provided no warmth, and Vishnu offered no protection to devotees whose faith had never wavered. Hindu texts from this period speak of the world entering its final age, when righteousness would weaken and natural order would collapse before the cycle began anew. But knowing that suffering was prophesied provided little comfort to populations who watched their children die, while the gods they had served faithfully since birth offered no intervention. Buddhist monasteries that had taught the impermanence of all things found even their philosophical preparation inadequate for catastrophe on this scale. Monks who had spent lifetimes meditating on the nature of suffering discovered that intellectual understanding meant nothing when faced with starvation that made contemplation impossible. The middle way between extremes became impossible to follow when the choice was between feeding refugees or maintaining monastic discipline. In China, where the mandate of heaven had connected virtuous rule to natural abundance for centuries, the simultaneous withdrawal of divine favor from all earthly authorities created political chaos that matched the agricultural disaster. Emperors who had maintained proper rituals and moral conduct found themselves ruling over regions where the sky itself had apparently rejected human civilization. Confucian scholars who had taught that cosmic harmony reflected moral leadership discovered that their philosophy offered no explanation for universal catastrophe that affected virtuous and corrupt rulers equally. The elaborate ceremonies designed to maintain balance between heaven and earth continued to be performed, but they produced no change in the darkened sky or failed harvests. Celtic druids in Britain and Ireland, whose traditions preserved memories of previous cosmic winters, recognized patterns from their oldest stories playing out in contemporary reality. The endless winter that had seemed like mythological metaphor was revealed as historical memory, preserved in oral tradition that stretched back to previous volcanic catastrophes. Norse communities throughout Scandinavia saw the Fimbul winter from their prophecies manifesting with literal precision. 3 consecutive years of killing cold that would precede the final battle between gods and the forces of chaos had apparently begun, though no divine warriors appeared to fight the cosmic enemies that had darkened the sun. The failure of established religions created space for desperate innovations. Mystery cults that promised direct spiritual experience gained followers among populations whose traditional faiths had proven powerless. New prophets arose, claiming special revelation about why the gods had withdrawn their favor and what sacrifices might restore divine blessing. Human sacrifice, which civilized societies had abandoned centuries earlier, returned among communities desperate enough to try any means of securing supernatural intervention. The taboos that had governed religious practice during prosperous times dissolved under pressure of starvation that made any offering seem preferable to continued suffering. Christian communities began to fracture over interpretations of the catastrophe. Some saw divine punishment for insufficient faith. Others interpreted the darkness as a sign of Christ's imminent return. Still others wondered if God had simply abandoned a creation that had proven unworthy of divine attention. The unified church that had seemed triumphant during imperial prosperity splintered into competing theological explanations for cosmic failure. Persian fire worshippers abandoned temples where sacred flames had died despite constant tending. The religion that had promised light's eventual triumph over darkness seemed to have been proven false when the sun itself had grown weak and ineffective against forces of shadow. In India, some Brahmins declared that the gods had never existed, that the elaborate rituals they had performed for generations were meaningless ceremonies that provided no connection to supernatural powers. Others doubled down on religious observance, insisting that only more perfect ritual performance could restore divine favor that had been lost through human inadequacy. The silence of heaven created a spiritual vacuum that would reshape human religious consciousness for centuries. The confident faiths that had flourished during periods of prosperity gave way to pessimistic beliefs that emphasized divine transcendence and human powerlessness. The gods who had once seemed like reliable partners in human enterprise had either departed entirely or revealed themselves as fundamentally alien to human welfare, transforming worship from confident supplication into desperate attempts to appease powers whose intentions remained forever mysterious. As if 5 years of famine had not been curse enough, the year 541 brought a new horror that made the disappeared sun seem like merely the prologue to a catastrophe whose true dimensions were only now revealing themselves. The plague ships arrived from Egypt in late spring, when what passed for warmth in this new world had begun to stir hopes that the worst might be ending. But the vessels that limped into Constantinople's harbours carried more than disappointing cargoes and crews, weakened by years of poor nutrition. In their holds, among the grain sacks that contained barely enough wheat to feed the city for days rather than months, something else had made the journey from Alexandria. Something that would transform the slow starvation of empire into rapid extinction. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that had slumbered in the burrows of Nile Delta rodents for centuries, found in famine-weakened human populations the perfect conditions for explosive expansion. Rats that had fled Egypt's empty granaries carried their infected fleas aboard ships whose crews had no understanding of the invisible passengers they transported along with their official cargoes. The disease announced itself in Constantinople, with symptoms that physicians trained in classical medicine had never encountered in their texts or practical experience. Victims developed egg-sized swellings in their groins and armpits, buboes that gave the plague its eventual name, and died within days in fevered agony that no treatment could relieve. Some danced in delirium before death, others lay silent as stones, but all who contracted the disease faced the same inevitable outcome. Procopius, whose pen had already recorded the unprecedented agricultural failures and political chaos that had followed the sun's dimming, found himself documenting mortality on a scale that challenged the capacity of human language to express. 10,000 died daily, he wrote with the precision of a trained observer, and later the number of deaths was even greater. His ink captured the moment when Constantinople ceased to be a functioning city and became instead a vast necropolis, where the living served mainly as attendants for the dying. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague in the autumn of 541, his body developing the telltale buboes that had already claimed thousands of his subjects. For weeks, the empire's fate hung in balance as physicians who understood neither the disease's cause nor its treatment applied remedies that proved as useless as prayer. The emperor's survival, when it came, seemed miraculous to contemporaries who had watched 90% of victims succumb to identical symptoms. The plague's appetite proved indiscriminate, consuming aristocrats and slaves, bishops and heretics, Gothic warriors and Roman civilians with equal efficiency. The social hierarchies that had structured Byzantine civilization for centuries became meaningless distinctions when death arrived without regard for rank, wealth, or religious orthodoxy. Bodies accumulated faster than the city's infrastructure could process them. The traditional burial practices that had maintained order, even during the worst years of famine, broke down completely when daily mortality exceeded the capacity of gravediggers, funeral directors, and religious authorities to maintain proper ceremonies. Graves dug for a handful of victims filled too quickly, until they swallowed hundreds, then thousands, as death surged past all precedent. When the prepared burial sites overflowed, authorities resorted to stacking corpses in towers that rose from public squares, like monuments to civilizational collapse. When wooden structures proved insufficient to contain the accumulating dead, bodies were simply piled in open areas and burned in fires that consumed not only human flesh, but the furniture, clothing, and wooden buildings that provided fuel for cremations that never ended. Eventually, even burning became impossible when the living lacked strength to maintain the pyres. Constantinople's streets filled with decomposing bodies that lay where they had fallen, creating scenes that survivors would remember as visions of hell made manifest on earth. The city that had recently celebrated military victories and architectural achievements became a charnel house, where ordinary commerce ceased and normal social life became impossible. The plague followed the same trade routes that had once carried prosperity throughout the Mediterranean world. Every port that had received Egyptian grain, every caravan stop that had hosted merchants from Alexandria, every city connected to Constantinople through commercial networks, became a node of infection that spread the disease throughout the empire and beyond its borders. Across Syria, villages emptied as illness consumed populations weakened by repeated crop failures. Sanctuaries that had served as refuge during famine turned into sites of infection, congregations undone by the very places that had once sustained their hope. The disease reached Persia through the same trading connections that had linked the great empires during prosperous times. Ctesiphon, already struggling with agricultural collapse and political fragmentation, watched its population succumb to an enemy that acknowledged no diplomatic immunity or religious protection. Italian cities that had recently been reconquered by Justinian's armies found themselves conquered instead by microscopic invaders that proved more effective than any barbarian assault. Ravenna, Rome, and Naples became ghost towns, where survivors scavenged among the ruins of classical civilization that the plague had reduced to empty shells. The demographic catastrophe exceeded anything recorded in human history. Contemporary estimates suggest that 25 million people died from plague alone, a number that must be added to the uncounted millions who had already perished during 5 years of famine. Entire regions lost 70% of their populations to the combined effects of starvation and disease, their empty territories reverting to wilderness that would not be resettled for generations. Medical knowledge that had been accumulating since the time of Hippocrates proved utterly inadequate against a disease that operated according to biological principles no ancient physician had ever encountered. The treatments that had served for centuries, bloodletting, herbal remedies, dietary modifications, provided no relief for symptoms that belonged to no category of illness that classical medicine recognized. Though catastrophe consumed the world, human dignity endured in the form of solitary acts of heroism. In Constantinople, a minor official named John organized grain distribution that saved thousands of lives, continuing his work even after contracting the plague himself. He died ensuring that the last shipment of imported wheat reached the city's poorest districts his sacrifice representing the kind of selfless service that prevented complete societal disintegration. Similar stories emerged from cities throughout the empire, as ordinary people performed extraordinary service despite facing personal extinction. These acts of compassion, preserved in chronicles written by survivors who witnessed civilization's collapse, provide evidence that human nature retained its capacity for goodness, even when external circumstances had created conditions that seemed designed to bring out humanity's worst instincts. When the plague ended in 544, it had already devoured most of the vulnerable. The silence it left was profound, deeper than famine's grip, and the empire that remained was little more than a name, its lands barren, its institutions shattered, its future resting in fragments of past glory. The year 537 brought no relief from heaven's wrath, no sign that the cosmic machinery had remembered how to function according to natural laws that had governed earthly existence since creation itself. The sun remained weak, giving light without warmth, through skies that still carried the bronze tint of volcanic poison. Temperatures stayed locked in perpetual autumn, never reaching levels that would allow seeds to germinate or plants to resume growth that had sustained human civilization for millennia. Farmers who had preserved their last grain through 536's catastrophic harvest planted those precious seeds in desperate hope. They watched their fields with the intensity of parents monitoring sick children, willing life into soil that had forgotten how to nurture growth. But the crops that emerged from earth, still struggling to warm above freezing, proved as doomed as their predecessors, withering before they could produce anything resembling harvestable yield. In 538, the world endured its third consecutive year of agricultural failure, a blow that broke once resilient communities and dragged human existence back to its most primitive state. Bonds that had long held societies together gave way under forces no government was prepared to withstand. Survivors from this period described eating grass that provided bulk without nutrition, tree bark boiled into something resembling porridge, leather goods soaked and cooked until desperate stomachs could process them. When these alternatives were exhausted, some communities consumed earth itself, clay mixing with saliva to fill empty bellies while providing no actual nourishment. Chronicles record with clinical precision the moment when human societies crossed boundaries that had previously seemed absolute. Parents faced choices no moral system had ever addressed: which children to feed when only one could survive, which family members deserved the last scraps when sharing equally would condemn everyone to death. From Ireland to China, records tell of cannibalism, the ultimate taboo, as famine forced the living to consume the dead. Social orders that had stood for millennia dissolved when food itself, the basis of all hierarchy, disappeared. Communities that had survived the initial catastrophe through cooperation turned violent as resources dwindled to nothing. Villages that had shared meager stores during the first year of crisis were raiding each other's empty granaries by the third, their inhabitants fighting over rumors of hidden grain that usually proved to be wishful thinking. Even successful hunters pursued game that had died or migrated beyond human reach. Forests that should have provided alternative food sources stood empty of deer, wild boar, and smaller animals that had traditionally supplemented agricultural diets. Birds had vanished from skies where they could no longer navigate, while fish populations declined in waters too cold to sustain normal breeding cycles. The period from 537 to 539 became known simply as the Hunger in multiple languages, needing no further explanation for survivors who had lived through years when starvation dominated every aspect of human existence. Irish monks found their hands shaking too violently from malnutrition to hold writing instruments steady. Chinese court historians left blank pages in official annals because they lacked strength for coherent documentation. Then, so gradually that few dared acknowledge the change, observers began noticing subtle improvements, suggesting the worst might be ending. By late 539, the sun appeared marginally stronger, its disk more clearly defined against skies where the perpetual bronze haze seemed fractionally less dense. The red tinge that had colored daylight since the catastrophe began slowly faded toward orange, then yellow, as atmospheric conditions finally began retreating toward normalcy. Temperature increases remained barely perceptible, perhaps half a degree that instruments could measure but human senses barely detected. Yet farmers noticed that certain hardy plants showed signs of attempting growth for the first time since the disaster began. By the year 540, harvests returned in part, and what little was gathered seemed abundant to peoples who no longer remembered true agricultural success. Barley that ripened despite the shortened seasons yielded perhaps a fifth of normal output. Yet to communities that had lived on bark and grass for 3 years, even this was hailed as a miraculous return of cosmic order. Survivors emerged from hiding places where they had waited out the worst, their bodies bearing permanent marks of prolonged malnutrition, but their spirits lifted by evidence that the world had not ended permanently. Markets reopened with offerings that would have been considered pathetic during prosperous times, but seemed like cornucopias to people whose memories of abundance had begun to seem like dreams. With cautious hope, marriages returned, as people once again imagined futures that might include children. Couples approached procreation warily, scarred by memories of cosmic upheaval. For the children born in the darkness, who had never known the sun's true light, the strengthening sky was a wonder their parents recalled, but they themselves were seeing for the very first time. Seeds hoarded through the worst years, grain preserved at enormous personal cost, when consuming it might have meant survival for another week, were planted with reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. These genetic repositories, maintained through sacrifices that had sometimes cost human lives, represented hope for agricultural restoration. The volcanic veil began its final dissipation during 540 and 541, though temperatures remained below pre-536 levels for another decade, as disrupted climate systems slowly recovered their previous patterns. The gradual return to normalcy would require most of a generation to complete, but by 542, the immediate crisis had ended, even as secondary consequences continued reshaping what remained of human society. A slow dawn rose upon a world that looked little like the one that had preceded the vanished sun. Life, however, had not yielded. Adaptation carried the species through its closest passage to extinction, and from the remnants left behind, humanity began piecing civilization together again. The world that crawled from the shadow of 536 was unrecognizable, not changed, but reborn as something entirely alien to what had come before. Rome was finished, not conquered by barbarians, not fallen to civil war, but simply emptied by forces no legion could fight. The dream of empire died not in some climactic battle, but in the quiet evacuation of cities that could no longer feed their inhabitants. Justinian's grand vision of restored imperial glory became as obsolete as worship of Jupiter, irrelevant to populations who measured wealth not in gold, but in surviving children. Where emperors had ruled from marble palaces, local warlords now commanded from wooden fortresses. Where citizens had debated philosophy in public forums, peasants now begged protection from whoever controlled the nearest food stores. The sophisticated urban civilization that had seemed as permanent as the mountains had dissolved like salt in rain. The Catholic Church stood alone among the ruins, the only institution that had not simply collapsed when the sky turned bronze. Bishops became the new governors, monasteries the new administrative centers, and Christian rituals, the only ceremonies that still promised meaning when all other authorities had proven powerless against cosmic forces. In monasteries scattered across the depopulated landscape, monks who had once copied theological treatises now preserved the memory of how to make bread rise, how to plant grain that might survive shortened growing seasons, how to organize communities that could endure when the familiar world had ended. These became the universities of a new age, schools where survival was the only curriculum that mattered. Feudalism was not a political theory imposed by conquerors, but a practical arrangement born of desperation. Lords were simply those who had managed to keep people alive when central governments could not, and serfs were free farmers who had traded liberty for the promise of protection and food. The bonds that held medieval society together were written not in law codes, but in the shared memory of years when such bonds had meant the difference between survival and extinction. The great cities emptied like broken vessels. Constantinople, which had housed 500,000 souls, could barely sustain 50,000. Rome, the eternal city, became a collection of villages scattered among ruins too vast for their diminished population to maintain. The urban civilization that had defined classical antiquity became a historical curiosity, as remote from lived experience as the mythical golden age that poets had once imagined. Where goods had once crossed seas and continents, trade dwindled to nearby swaps of necessities alone. The Silk Road, which had carried luxuries from China to Mediterranean markets for centuries, was abandoned by merchants who now considered themselves fortunate to transport grain 20 miles without losing it to bandits. Commerce itself had to be reinvented for an impoverished world where survival trumped profit. Technology adapted to reality. Watermills and windmills, once curiosities, became essential when human labor was too scarce to waste on grinding grain by hand. The plow was redesigned for smaller teams of oxen, since great herds had perished and could not be replaced. Innovation was driven not by ambition, but by the simple need to accomplish more with fewer hands. Forests reclaimed territories that had been farmland for centuries, not through any conscious rewilding, but because there were no longer enough people left to maintain cultivation. The deforestation that had worried Roman administrators reversed itself within a generation, creating the medieval landscape of deep woods, punctuated by small clearings, where communities huddled around their churches and markets. Knowledge itself changed character. The vast libraries that had preserved classical learning became irrelevant when the immediate question was whether this year's harvest would support life through another winter. Practical wisdom, how to preserve meat without salt, how to make leather from bark, how to maintain hope when all precedents had failed, became more valuable than philosophy. The survivors who rebuilt civilization carried in their bones the memory of how quickly everything could disappear. Their children grew up hearing stories of cities that had held millions, of ships that had carried silk across oceans, of emperors who had commanded armies larger than the populations of entire kingdoms in the New World. These tales sounded like myths, because the reality they described had become literally unimaginable. Medieval Europe's obsession with apocalypse, its conviction that the world was always on the verge of ending, its desperate religiosity in the face of cosmic uncertainty, all these characteristics traced directly to the years when the sun had failed and civilization had died. The disappeared sun had created not just political transformation, but psychological change that would shape human consciousness for centuries. Classical antiquity had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, the quiet exhalation of a world that had simply run out of breath. What emerged from its ashes was smaller, poorer, more brutal, but also more durable, because it had learned lessons about survival that prosperous civilizations had never needed to master. The age of emperors and philosophers had yielded to the age of lords and priests, not through conquest, but through the simple fact that when the sun grows weak, only the most essential human activities can continue. Everything else, art, learning, commerce, the dreams that had driven classical ambition, had proven to be luxuries that starving populations could not afford. 6 years have passed since the sun disappeared. The immediate crisis has ended, but the world will never reclaim what was lost in those years when heaven forgot the earth. Empires that once commanded continents now struggle to control their own capitals. Constantinople rules little beyond its walls. The Sassanid Empire has retreated into its Persian heartland. Chinese kingdoms claim authority over provinces they cannot reach. Villages by the thousands stand empty across every continent, their inhabitants dead or fled, never to return. Entire peoples have vanished, tribes whose names appear in no later chronicle, cities whose locations become mysteries within a generation. The great trade routes that connected humanity lie broken like discarded jewelry. Where merchant caravans once carried silk and spices, wolves now hunt through abandoned towns. Forests reclaim farmland with frightening speed, erasing in seasons what human hands had built over centuries. The survivors carry trauma that reshapes civilization itself. Children who lived through the darkness become adults who hoard grain obsessively, who teach their own children to expect catastrophe, who view every sunset with the unspoken fear that this might be the last normal one they will see. Communities develop fierce bonds forged by shared suffering, viewing all outsiders with permanent suspicion, born of years when strangers meant competition for resources that barely sustained life. Around winter fires, when the work of rebuilding pauses and families gather close for warmth, elders tell stories of the time the sun disappeared. These are not legends or myths passed down through generations of embellishment. These are testimonies, preserved in living memory, of the closest humanity has ever come to extinction. In Ireland, they remember the bread that wouldn't rise. In China, they speak of the yellow dust that tasted of death. In Mexico, they recall when the feathered serpent abandoned the world. The details differ, but the core truth remains the same across every culture that survived. There was a time when the light failed, and the earth forgot how to sustain life. Yet it is not the dramatic collapse that haunts the aftermath, but the silence that followed. This is not the peaceful quiet of a world at rest, but the hollow silence of aftermath. Empty houses with meals still on tables, as if their inhabitants had simply stepped outside and never returned. Ships floating crewless in harbours, their cargoes rotting in holds that no one remains to unload. Libraries where no one comes to read, the accumulated wisdom of ages gathering dust because the communities that created such knowledge no longer exist to preserve it. Temples stand empty, their gods apparently having departed along with their worshippers. The elaborate ceremonies that once filled these sacred spaces with music and incense have been reduced to the occasional visit from survivors who light a candle and whisper prayers to deities who may no longer be listening. This is how antiquity ends, not with barbarian triumph or imperial collapse, but with the slow failing of the light and the terrible silence that follows. The confident civilizations that had seemed eternal, that had built monuments intended to last forever, discovered that their permanence was as fragile as a flame in wind. Centuries carried forward the memory of the sun's disappearance, embedding it in myth, ritual, and the quiet terror that it might happen again. Every eclipse summoned unease. Every hard winter whispered of the age when frost refused to release its grip. In the spaces between heartbeats, where silence gathers before the next rhythm begins, something of those lost years persists. Not gone, but transformed. Not dead, but dreaming in the depths of human consciousness, where rational thought gives way to older forms of knowing. The ancient world died in 536, but its ghost walks still through the stories survivors tell their children, through the practices they maintain to guard against catastrophe, through the simple human knowledge that the light we depend on is not guaranteed to last forever. When the sun disappeared, humanity learned that awareness itself is fragile in a cosmos where no constant is beyond collapse. In surviving that truth, people found within themselves a resilience strong enough to endure future nights still to come.